so there was the aforementioned Scientific American article. This is the basic situation, and what you can see, here's how the general setup it is, how the wood starts to deform under the pressure of that. Here's the kind of crack that begins to form at the bottom, and that would then perpetuate up there. Here again is an analysis of some of the basic forces. This is in effect, for all intents and purposes, this is the mass of your hand or whatever else you're striking with, moving at its initial velocity, coming down into this additional mass of the board itself. At the end of all of this, this should be happening, and ideally the amount of the energy that's caught up in that situation should be able to rupture this. And that's the formula of what I was just talking about. So there you have the volume of block, the modulus of rupture, which is the amount of stress the material itself can handle, and the modulus of elasticity, which is that stiffness. Okay. These were, by the way, some studies, going back to the Scientific American article, looking at different kinds of techniques that people can use, at different sorts of like a forward punch, a sort of downward hammer fist strike, the kind of knife hand strike, the traditional kind of karate chop, a roundhouse kick, which is something like this, and it makes an interesting point in the article about all of this, that when you are throwing a roundhouse kick, that this leg is coming this way, typically, almost sometimes in an unnoticeable way, your arm will be coming back, moving the opposite way. Why? Because you're preserving some level of angular momentum to keep yourself from spinning around. So, the different sorts of analyses of different, thank you so much. Thanks so much. That's great, Andy. Thank you also. So, and then the different sorts of the various sorts of strengths, and all of these are the speeds of those weapons that can drill down to wood or whatever else. It's also, we're looking at the biomechanics of this, because if you're talking about the throwing a punch, there's an interesting question of when then is the moment of peak speed when you throw a punch, where along the course of that moving is it moving its fastest? And the answer is, it moves at its fastest a little bit short of the maximum length. So you can see that here. This is the speed. They study this stroboscopically. You see it continues to gather speed, but a little bit short of actually striking. It then starts to drop off a lot. Why does that happen? Well, basically, it's part of what your body does to protect itself. It's not just a matter that you're actually starting to pull out on the maximum length at which anything can go, but your body actually, in the interest of not constantly hyperextending all of its joints, there are reflexes that are set up that will spontaneously start to activate the opposing muscle groups when you're making some sorts of fast ballistic actions, and it will cause them to slow down a little bit. So the moment of maximum, if I'm trying to hit this, I do not want to try to hit it here at the very outside. I actually want to think trying to hit it through it, past it, which is what they will usually tell you. Don't think of trying to hit the board. Think of trying to hit something that's a couple of inches behind the board. If you do that, then the moment of when you're hitting this can be at its point of the maximum speed of your hand moving through all of it. And again, this is some of the force of the equation of what's involved in this. Here's the key of it, of a hand that's coming in. If you're talking about the analysis actually there's an analysis from that article of a hammer fist strike, in which the mass that's involved is not just the hand, but actually that of the forearm. The key thing here is that if you're doing this, you can be delivering about more than a ton of force onto this very, very sharply. And that's obviously is a lot. At that point, if you know that that's the amount of force that is transiently being put on this, it's not too surprising that the board will break. Especially because part of what also shows up with this is that it really only takes about 500 newtons or so to be able to deform a board, to actually push to the point where it needs to be able to deflect like a centimeter or two, at which point the wood will actually then break. All of this is sort of the theory of a lot of this. There are also, though, the actual practical things that are worth knowing. One, it's a board, and in this way it's cut almost square. Cutting it almost square like this is great from a demonstration standpoint, because if you have a naive audience, they don't actually notice that there is a difference, and why it is that I would want to try to make sure that I'm hitting it and holding it this way, and not hitting it, say, this way. Why? The grain of the wood. Because the wood consists of long strands of cellulose, which is very strong, tough material, which is then basically glued together by a different material. The material holding the strands of cellulose together is weaker than the material of the cellulose itself. So you naturally, and you know this if you do any sort of woodworking, you want to break it along the grain. If you break it along the grain, it will break much more smoothly and easily. It wants to separate along the grain. It does not want to try to separate by trying to break those strands of the cellulose along the way. So that's one part of it. Similarly, the board, again, it's because it's almost square like this. It's not completely square. It's a little bit longer along one dimension this way. Why does that matter? Well, because if it were a lot longer, it would be a lot more obvious, especially if you know the trick with the grain, about why it is that if I hit it then in the middle, I have tremendous mechanical advantage that will allow this to then break. Imagine that rather than just breaking this board like this, that I'm actually breaking a board that's now, like, say, 5 feet off to either side. Now imagine that this board is actually perched one little bit way out here and one little bit way out here on this end. There's an obviously long, long stretch of material of this board itself that is unsupported. The board is already under a lot of strain, just from its own weight. So for me then to come along and pop it in the middle, it makes it very easy at that point for it to break. By pulling it in like this, you're making more of a realistic challenge. But think about this when you do actually see sometimes some demonstrations when people will do things like have really big slabs of stuff, big slabs of ice, big slabs of slate. When I was actually getting this, the guy from Lumberyard who was giving me this was remembering a fantastic demonstration he'd seen of somebody years ago who had broken 1,000 pounds of slate. I was like, wow, slate, yeah, that's right. That slate is itself a relatively soft rock, and 1,000 pounds means it almost certainly was a very big slab. I suspect that although, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of work that was involved in, you still had to know what you were doing to be able to break that it's a lot less astonishing if you understand the basic physics and the strain already present on that. It would probably, under those circumstances, have been harder to break, say, 100 pounds of slate than the 1,000 pounds would have been. All of this, what I just said, is obviously the theory. Let's see what happens with some practice. So I have this a couple of boards. As I said, ordinarily, I would try to have somebody actually hold some boards or try to set something up with different kinds of like cinder blocks as a little bit of a bench. So the arrangement on this is a little off. Anybody want to check the boards? You're a room full of skeptics, but don't do that. You should want to check the boards, because another one of the tricks that can be used with this is if I take this is a piece of wood I just got from the lumberyard yesterday. It's a perfectly ordinary piece of wood, but if I, say, popped this into an oven earlier this morning, and for just a little while, I could drive the moisture out of it, at which point it becomes a lot more brittle. It makes it a lot easier to break. So, here, check that out. It is an actual board, right? And these are all actual, real boards, such as one would find at a place that sold actual, real boards. It has a slight curvature.
Does it matter which way that's going?
What I will do is that, in fact, I will take advantage of that, and I will hit it on the side that's the slightly more concave side. Again, taking advantage of the fact that that side already sort of bent in a little bit.
And also, does that give you a better vector?
A little bit through that, as opposed to the other side, when I have to, it's the equivalent of like I'm trying to hit it on top of like the dome of something. I have to work harder to break it on the inside. So these are all, some of you are welcome to check any of and all of these, but basically saying, you notice I'm giving him those. I'm not giving him, say, this. Why? What's the difference between those pieces of wood and this piece of wood?
Knot hole in the center?
Big knot holes in the center. Big knot holes make for big irregular shapes. The grain is no longer consistent. Knots of wood, and you know this if you try to cut them, very hard. Trying to hit them with your hand, very painful. I've made that mistake. I had my hand bounce right off wood. Not good.
How much longer is it going with the grain?
I don't have a figure for that, so I don't know, but it's sort of clearly it's a big difference. So anyway, as I say, the situation on this, and you'll definitely want to have this on video, because I haven't actually broken anything in a really long time, and if this goes wrong, you will want this for YouTube. So here it is, and I put at this point, so just put the board, I just put it so it's a little bit like maybe an inch or so to either side. I just want it to not move. You can do this with someone holding it, but it's really important that person that they keep it rigid that way. At this point, I should probably be invoking all the mystical energies of the universe, but I'm not really going to. I'm just going to. Sometimes when people will break stuff, they will actually they'll stack things up. You'll see stacks of them. There's a big difference between whether people are doing them with stacks one atop, flush like this, or whether they have spacers. If they use spacers, and I'm not taking anything away from the people who are doing this, because with all of these things, I see these as techniques, not tricks. They are, you have to know what you're doing in order to make this work. People will mess up their hands badly. I would otherwise actually invite people to do this, but there's sort of limited liability issues I would rather not risk. If you've got the spacer, what happens, and this is why it can be sometimes easier to break big stacks of things than it would seem, is because when the top board breaks, the edges of it then come down and hit the next board. When they hit with their own, because they picked up angular momentum. They're capturing some more of the energy that was in my fist when I was striking it in the first place, which then helps transfer down into the next one, and so on. So you see people can break like big stacks of stuff. It's easier, breaking like 8 boards stacked up in that way is not 8 times as hard as breaking 1 board. Breaking 2 boards like this can actually be more than twice as hard than just doing it 1 at a time. Which is why this may be the part, again, 911, hello YouTube. See? Let's try that again. Who's not paying attention? Let's see what will happen. Way. I appreciate your applause, but believe me, people who do breaking, this is nothing. The guy I studied with, he will kick through a pair of baseball bats at a time, which I don't know what the trick is.
For an editor, they're impressive.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to move on real fast and just talk about one thing very, very quickly, which is the wonderful world of dim muck and deft touch techniques, which is probably one of those sort of quintessential goofy woo ideas from the martial arts. And the question is, are there such things as these magical pressure points that people can touch, particularly in fighting, and just kill you on the spot? And the answer is, no, not really. At least nothing that I'm aware of would suggest that that is true. In some respects, if you just think of it almost from like an evolutionary standpoint, would it really make sense for us to have managed to evolve over countless years, and we have like this spot right here that at any time somebody just goes up and go, oh, and I'm out. There are, however, lots of spots all across the body that when you do have nerve plexuses and arteries that are near the surface, and it's not just a case of like pressing a button, but if you do actually wrap them hard in the right way, it will hurt a lot. It will shock people, and it's something that can make a difference. So, as a deft touch technique, probably grossly overstating it, and it's surrounded by layer upon layer of sort of nonsense. But fundamentally, a lot of these things are a lot of the points that people will go for, they're perfectly reasonable scientific points in terms of trying to hit where the nerves are relatively exposed. Whether people can actually do that in practice when they're fighting is a whole other issue, and people will fight about that stuff all the time. I've taken way too much of your time already. Questions or, oh good, we have like 5 minutes.
Yeah,